Hello and welcome back to Friday Minis. Now, we've previously discussed higher order functions. It's this really cool thing you could do in programming languages that allow you to write functions that potentially return or take in functions. Today, we're going to look at one way in which we could use higher order functions, and that is in the world of partial applications and currying. Of course, in order to understand what I'm saying here at all, you'll probably want to take a look at higher order functions first. So yeah, there's the link to the video up there, or there, one of those corners. In discussing partial application of functions, there is something really interesting to see as well in the way functions actually behave that we don't really get to appreciate very often if we were to do just, day-to-day normal programming. And that is the notion of how by using higher order functions, you can actually sort of lock some values into a function itself. But let's start from the beginning. Let's start very simple, and that is with a simple function that adds two numbers together. That's nothing new, right? This function will take in two parameters and return the answer. Short and simple. But now let's think about the contrived situation in which you only have one of the two numbers. Typically what we'll do is we would store the number first, wait for the second number to come along, then call the function. Well, with partial application, there's another thing you can actually do. Instead of storing the first value, which needs to wait for a while, into a variable, instead you create a new function and lock that value into the function. Here's how we do it. This function called addPartial takes in our first parameter, right, which is the first number that we actually want to add. Then we create a new function, which takes in the second parameter. Now, we're just defining the function at this stage, right? The second parameter does not exist yet. But here's the critical part. This new function will return the first value added to the second value. That's the actual addition calculation that we want to do. But what we return is that function. Therefore, addPartial is a higher order function, right? It's a function that returns a function. Our first parameter, the value that we've entered before, is already locked inside this function. All it's waiting for is the second value, and when the second value comes along, we'll do the addition and get the answer. Partial applications like this allow you to do a couple of interesting things. For example, you can make calls in this manner. What we're doing here is we're calling a function that returns a function, and then we're calling that second function right away to get the answer. Well, in effect, we're not doing something very different from just, calling a binary function, that is a function that takes in two parameters. Well, this is the partial application method. There are some other situations in which this may come in handy as well. For example, if you wanted to run a particular function that has been set up in a certain way on a bunch of things, you can. Let's say we create a function here called add2. The idea is we've already locked the number 2 into that function. So whatever parameter comes along, we plus 2 to that number, and that's our answer. So yeah, this allows us to do code reuse as well in a very convenient manner. What's cool is that you can even write a function that does this automatically for you. So you give it a function that is binary in nature, and it'll give you the so-called partial application version. You can see that over here, I've created a multiply function, and I'm just passing it along to this guy, which will break it down for me in the appropriate manner. Just as an aside, the notion of partial application is related to what is known as currying. Now, currying sort of takes partial application one step further. In currying, every intermediate step must take in exactly one parameter. That means if we're going to do an addition of 3 values, we have to break it down into 3 function calls, each one taking in exactly one parameter. In the world of partial application, it's not so strict. The first call could take in 1, the next call could take in 2, that's fine. But yeah, at the end of the day, they're based on the same concept. Have a function that takes in multiple parameters and break it down into multiple functions that take in the parameters separately. So yeah, an interesting technique backed by interesting mechanisms that produce the same results. Quite an interesting thing about programming languages that we may or may not be familiar with. Anyway, that's it. That's all there is for this episode of Friday Minis. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, you're watching 0612 TV with NERDfirst.net.